Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, a podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm an investigative journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are economists, scientists, politicians, academics, activists, and they explain the complexities of the energy, economic, and ecological crises that we face today. And they reveal their solutions to mitigate the damage to our future. This is a critical time for our planet. It demands critical thinking. Hit the subscribe button now or go to planetcritical.com to learn more. On this week's show is systems engineer and author Alice Friedemann. Alice joined me to discuss all things energy and how climate change is not the real problem, it is the energy crisis as far as she is concerned. She explains how peak oil can precipitate nation-state collapse. She explains how renewables will never be able to meet the demands that are met by fossil fuels. She explains why governments are subsidizing in all the wrong places. And she also has some pretty good news about how the IPCC models might be wrong, but in a positive way. For those who are worried about the future, Alice has some advice what individuals and communities can do to prepare for how life is likely to change over the coming decades. And she says that there is much hope to be had for a post-carbon world. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. But if you love the episode, do consider supporting Planet Critical on Patreon, where you'll find bonus episodes of my thoughts on each interview. The Patreon link is in the description box below, and thanks to everyone who's already supporting the project. I'm so excited to speak to you. Thank you very much for making the time for me.
Oh, no worries. With COVID, there's lots of free time these days.
True, very true. So I've been going through your website, energyskeptic.com, and unfortunately have not gotten my hands on a copy of your book, Life After Fossil Fuels. But I was hoping we could go through specifically that fossil fuel versus renewables question, touching on nuclear as well, because that's coming up a lot recently. And then ultimately coming around to that little subtitle that you have on your site, collapse or extinction, and maybe seeing if there's secret option number 3.
Oh, life will continue. I don't think extinction's likely. Um,
Extinction for humankind or the entire planet?
um, I don't think either of those is likely. Some things would survive, and people are quite resourceful.
Mm,
We were on a trip into the Manu Biosphere Preserve in the Amazon basin of Peru, and the guide said that the uncontacted people were probably watching us canoe down the river. And so there's people in these really remote areas
mm,
that have learned how to live off the land for millennia.
yeah, yeah. But I think what's so frightening about coming face to face with the potential realities of what society might look like in the coming decades is recognizing that with all the decadence that we have in our current way of life and all the technical knowledge, maybe technological knowledge, certainly privileged knowledge, if we were to run out of fossil fuels tomorrow, for example, me as an individual, I'd be screwed. I don't know what to do.
It's true. I think most of us would be in trouble, um, except people that were, or farming the land,
Mm,
organic
mm,
farmers way out in the remote countryside.
mm,
So life after fossil fuels makes a big case. We should be doing what we can to return to agriculture, because without fossil fuels, that's how 80 to 90% of the people will need to make a living.
mhm, mhm.
For the lucky 10 to 20% in the towns, or maybe not so lucky if you read about what towns and cities were like. Uh, they weren't great either.
Yeah.
That's where diseases spread. But
My fear is that some form of like bioaristocracy will come back and will essentially all be um serfs of some sort, like being given land to work on it to provide for ourselves, which will facilitate a certain percentage of the population to continue living whatever kind of life they like.
that's my fear too. I mean, look at in America, Ralph Nader did a book on who owns the land, and it's something like, uh, aside from the federal government and state governments, 3% of private people own 85% of the remaining land. So it's highly concentrated, just
Yeah.
like the one percenter, the wealth. It's ridiculously highly concentrated.
Exactly. And people talk a lot about wealth. That's sort of become one of the main focuses for, I would say, activism. And linking it to climate change is very, very good because, the more money that you have and you're spending, obviously, the higher your energy as well output. But if we go beyond a couple of decades where the financial system is at risk of collapse, then it is these things about land. Like that's where those concentrations are going to become extremely important. I just wonder if collapse is going to be so bad that like title deeds won't mean anything. Like you own this land, give. We don't care. We're coming in.
I think that's definitely a possibility, but, human nature seems to sort itself into an upper 20%, bottom 80%. So,
Yeah.
even in hunter-gatherer societies, apparently not everyone's, equal, but more equal, I'm for hunter-gathering since women have, quite a bit more, power and control and status and equality. Agriculture is not so great for women.
But even kind of discussing hunter-gatherer societies, there were so many different formations, so many different societies. It wasn't just as simple as that was the way that it was all work for kind of pre-civilized humans or whatever. Like I'm reading, and I say this every week on the podcast, which is really embarrassing because it shows how slowly I'm reading it. But right now, I'm reading David Graeber and David Wengrow's The Dawn of Everything, and they've gone through the archives to show what French missionaries were writing about the Wendat people, and other kind of indigenous tribes. And it's so interesting because it was the indigenous people that kind of, in their version, introduced the concepts of freedom and liberty and equality to the Westerners. Because in their yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, they're almost like little experimental labs, each little tribe, and at some
Mm,
point, people splinter off, and then they can, form a new tribe. Lots of experimentation, going on.
exactly. Exactly. So yes, we probably would make it through. But let's talk about where you see us going, what you think is going to happen. I would love to know or to hear you say out loud kind of what you think of the renewable energy industry. And whether or not all of this focus essentially trying to stop us using fossil fuels overnight is kind of a huge distraction from what the underlying problem is, which is energy consumption.
Yeah, it's weird that climate change dominates the discussion, and
Mm,
that somehow people thought solving climate change meant electricity, um even though oil is what runs the world and always has, and it doesn't power the electric grid. In the 1970s crisis, that was the low-hanging fruit, and electricity was switched to coal, natural gas, and nuclear away from fossil fuels because they're so essential for transportation. And then you look at a crude barrel of oil. I mean, the obvious way to decide what is a problem is look at the very start of it. So, if oil needs to be replaced, then you look at a crude barrel of oil and, oh, there's 60 products. There's the propane, there's the fractions used only for plastics. They can't be in a
mhm,
transport fuel. But then you get into gasoline, kerosene for aircraft, diesel for trucks, ships and locomotives, asphalt for roads. Um, and then, well, what's the most important form of transportation? Um, in America, I would argue trucks because we have 4 million miles of roads,
mm,
um, and so 80% of communities are utterly dependent on trucks because they don't have a locomotive depot or a shipping port. So what do trucks burn? Diesel. The ones that matter, the ones that do actual work, not a pickup truck, but the long haul trucks. Above all, tractors and harvesters. How are you gonna have food without
mm.
diesel tractors and harvesters? They can't run on batteries because 'cause they'd be so heavy they'd compact the soil, and for decades, you would be unable to grow as much food. Not only that, the grid is thin. In rural areas, they were the last to get electricity, and they don't get much, and yet you'd need to charge all the tractors at planting season, and all the harvesters at the same time at harvest season in a given area, and the grid, couldn't support that. Um, and the electric grid itself can't stay up without natural gas to not only balance it, but it provides baseload. It provides power when the wind and solar aren't up. Period. Uh, with coal and nuclear, sort of the bottom notes of the orchestra of power grid that are constant and steady for the power required around the clock, and they can't ramp up quickly or down quickly, or it destroys their light. The lifetime is shortened. Only natural gas can ramp up and down quickly to match wind and solar kicking in and out, in and out. Um, we don't have storage. There's not enough places to put hydropower. As it is, only 10% of US states have 80% of all hydropower because we've got mountains and snow and things like that to keep the water flowing through the electric grid. And even then, it's only good for part of the year,
Mm.
typically April, which is also when solar is at its peak. So those are the two dispatchable renewables are competing with each other, um, and lowering the value of each of them too. But later on, you need to save it for drinking water, agriculture,
Mhm.
fisheries, ecosystems, and you can't just release the water whenever you want, even in the lucky states.
Mhm.
So there's no, and that's the best possible backup power. But although hydropower is not considered renewable because dams silt up and they last from 35 to 200 years and then they stop working. And then the
Yeah, but
concrete starts to go because the
but wind farms stop working too.
oh, absolutely. It's none of it's renewable. Wind turbines last 20 years
Yeah.
and 15 years offshore because of all the corrosion from the seawater and the immense battering of storm waves and currents. And then solar power lasts 18 to 25 years.
Oh, really?
So they constantly need rebuilding, and they need rebuilding with fossil fuels. There is
Mhm.
no electric way to make cement. Well, a wind turbine sits on, you know, dozens of tons of cement platforms because these things are huge. Um, and the wind the wind turbine blades are made of epoxy, which is oil. Um, the steel is made with coal. Yes, you can remelt existing steel, but that's only 70% of steel is made from scratch, and that's not to mention copper, iron, all the other metals that have to be smelted with the high heat of fossil fuels. They don't have an electric or hydrogen or ammonia or biofuel or on and on and on. There's no other way to make them. So you can't even make renewables. They're not renewable. They're rebuildable and only rebuildable while you still have fossil fuels. And the electric grid can only stay up while you have natural gas. Because also compressed air energy storage, there's only two of those in the whole world, and they require a salt cavern 1,500 to 3,000 feet down to store the air in. Um, and batteries, there's not enough materials on Earth to
Mm.
make even one battery that could store 1 day of US electric grid and electricity generated, and you'd need up to 6 weeks because energy is seasonal. Even in California, the solar power goes way down in the winter, and we certainly wouldn't be sharing it with other states. So national grid won't do you any good. Um, so yeah, it's if you can't have the okay, I'm sorry I'm talking so long, but I just ought to interject some good news here, which is
Yeah.
that, peak oil looks like it happened in 2018, and
Uh-huh.
it makes all other resources possible, including coal and natural gas. So, inevitably, climate change is going to begin to start to decline, and yeah, it's still gonna be horrible for centuries, it's a done deal, but we're not headed for the, scary IPCC hothouse Earth, and
Mm.
yet that's the only thing we're worried about. But the IPCC never modeled, um, how much likely fossil fuel reserves there were. Geologists did. They modeled what the likely outcomes would be with realistic, amounts of fossil fuels, and they came up with at least a dozen of them with ranges from 2.6 to 4.5 would maybe be where we end up.
Sorry, 2.6 to 4.5 what?
The representative control pathways of the they keep changing the outcomes, and then 2022 will be yet another thing, but, the IPCC doesn't model coal decline or oil or especially oil decline, and so 8 is where you get 6 is where you start to get the hothouse Earth, 8 is where you get the, extinction kind of talk that you have going on. Um, 2.6 is, like, it's not good. I think sea levels are locked in for sure no matter what, but it's not gonna, raise what's it called? The dew point, the point where, certain parts of the globe are unlivable because the, heat is so high.
Okay, so you're saying that the IPCC report, the models that were done to, and I'm not going to use scientific language here at all, but to predict, to model essentially where we will be in the future because of climate change, based on, I'm assuming, what energy consumption has been in the past, GDP growth, all of this kind of stuff. You're saying that they didn't actually factor in that we already hit peak oil and that it's a finite resource, that we won't be able to depend on
They
it.
assumed we would be burning fossil fuels exponentially until the year 2400. Why even model past 2100, right? They don't even bother to do that usually, although you can find people who did. But they made that assumption that we had they're pretty much like economists who assume there's no limits to growth. They are. It's crazy. It's pure capitalism, the IPCC models.
That's insane though, because we did hit it in 2018.
Well, not many people know that, but if you look at chapter 2 of my book, Life After Fossil Fuels, you'll see my citations for that, which are from the European International Energy Agency, which is often cited in the news as an authority, and the United States Energy Information Administration, which is also the agency of government that is supposed to um, let the rest of the government know where we stand with fossil fuels. They're both highly respected agencies, invented after the first oil crisis of 1973 so that we wouldn't be caught in that position again.
Okay. But then why weren't scientists screaming about it when the IPCC report was dropped? I didn't see anything about questioning the models.
Well, there've been, it's interesting, the first people who began warning about peak oil was M. King Hubbert. My grandfather taught him at the University of Chicago, and they
Oh,
were
wicked.
colleagues in the National Academy of Sciences and good friends. And M. King Hubbert warned in 1954, based on discoveries of oil, you can predict production of oil. You can only produce oil that's been discovered. And so you get these
Yes.
two little intersecting bell curves back in 1954. And then Walter Youngquist, I can't remember if he headed Exxon's research and discovery petroleum. He was very high level at Exxon. Colin Campbell, um, all these guys started warning back in the 1990s. Uh, these top oil guys, like, hey, the reserves aren't infinite. It made it into Scientific American. This stuff rarely made it into the papers of record. And I have a column at Energy Skeptic that's also at resilience.org. Why do politicians and economists deny peak oil and so on?
Hmm.
They can't get reelected. They're afraid the stock market would crash. There's a lot of reasons why it hasn't been in the news, but geologists, ecologists, biophysical and natural economists, ecologists in general, there's fields of science that are aware of this, that publish on it, that have peer-reviewed journals that are writing about this. Um, it's probably also not making its way into mass media because science writers are among the first journalists fired when there's an economic downturn
Hmm.
and the public's not
Hmm.
interested. And people, the hopeful stories you see, people are trying to get research money if they're in academia, or they're trying to get um, investors money if they're trying to do some kind of startup. Even back in 2005, when I went to my first peak oil conference in Denver, where then Mayor Hickenlooper presided. Now he's a senator of Colorado. We were talking amongst ourselves about uh, renewable energy would be the last big scam on Wall Street to make money.
Right. Yes, yes. I was just thinking, like, why would people not want to know? Why would we not be discussing peak oil? Even the fact that you can see the oil industry trying to move into renewables and try to move into the carbon credit market as well. I mean, surely just from the moves that they're making, we know that they know at some level that they're running out of their product. They're going to have to shift their business model. Um, but I was speaking to Nate Higgins, and he was saying that, oh, I'm gonna misquote him. GDP and energy output are always correlated. So if we did admit that that peak oil has passed and that we are going to run out of our most abundant energy source and our cheapest energy source, then it is likely that the stock market would take a downturn because energy would be taking a downturn, right?
Yeah, yeah. People don't want to know. I don't blame them. Who wants to be a farmer, right? It's better to think that you could just build, solar panels and continue your lifestyle
Mm.
unabated. I
Mm.
mean, yeah, I'm not surprised anymore. Nobody wants to know.
Mm. Yeah, well, I mean, it also would render so much of like other work, my work, a lot of academia as well. Everybody would have to be a farmer, apart from the landowners.
Yeah, I mean, and then you get into the more depressing areas of overshoot and carrying
What's that?
capacity.
Hmm.
You know, that's the other frustration I have with climate change. It sucks all the oxygen out of the biodiversity crisis, the ozone crisis, all the other existential threats that are happening, and it's not because of climate change. It's happening because there's too many people destroying the planet. I mean, in order to get the metals needed for renewable energy, one third of the Earth's surface would need to be mined, and especially in highly biodiverse areas. Like, how green is that? That
Good.
at least with an oil well, it's this little, you know, mosquito prick in
Yeah.
the earth with a very
Yeah.
small
Yeah.
surface platform that
Yeah.
it's mine. It's so destructive. It's every bit as destructive.
It's funny. My understanding of fossil fuel has changed so much since starting this podcast and speaking to experts. Funnily enough, and now when I think of fossil fuel use in the future, it's like, well, at least we can't eat it. At least that's not us using an essential ingredient to life on this planet like water just to power whatever it is that we think that we want to power. You know, when I see people go talking about biomass as a renewable source of energy, cutting down forests, um, to fuel our electricity grids or whatever. It's crazy. It's crazy. You want to destroy habitats, you want to destroy species, and you want to destroy the one thing that's removing carbon um, from the planet because you think just because you can plant a tree again, it's a renewable source. It's madness.
Fossil fuels are important to us, not just oil, but natural gas is how we make fertilizer through the Haber-Bosch process, which won the Nobel Prize in 1910 or so. And it's a way to grab nitrogen out of the air, which is what we need to grow plants, to grow our own bodies, for muscles, and it's essential. But nitrogen in the air is inert, doesn't want to come out of the air.
Mm.
So with natural gas, extremely high heat and pressure, you can force the nitrogen out of the air and combine it with the hydrogen atoms in natural gas to make ammonia, which is fertilizer, which is how we feed 4 billion people at least of the 8 billion people. So
Wow.
so now you need natural gas, absolutely essential for the electric grid, absolutely essential to feed people. and it's finite also, like
Mm.
oil.
What do you think is likely then to happen? Do you think that there will be that we're not going to prepare adequately, that there will be a mass starvation event in some parts of the world? I mean, already we're seeing in Central Africa right now, they're going through their third year of drought because of rising temperatures, etc. Like the people just cannot feed themselves. So do you think that that is likely to happen?
Well, as energy declines, we'll be less and less able to cope with natural disasters. I mean,
Mm.
you already have Yemen and Syria and all these failed states. Venezuela is on the way of coping with lack of energy. They all reached peak oil, and you can see it causes an economic collapse. So you'll just see that more and more countries. And then there's something that's famous. 11 of the 12 past recessions have been caused by high oil prices. And so then the general public can't afford that. You get a recession, oil goes down, the economy picks up. It's like a boom bust cycle. So you'll certainly at some point see um, a financial crisis uh, in many countries in the world. But people won't see it as an energy crisis, most likely. They'll just see it as a financial crisis because we're trained to see the world through politics and economics. So even the collapses in the Middle East are seen as political, but a drought is also at the root of a lot of the problems in the world, in addition to energy. It's complicated, right? It's not
Wow.
one single thing. But
That
yeah, it can't end well,
Yeah. Yeah.
especially when you're only focused on climate change and not on energy efficiency, and above all, consuming less.
Yeah. 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 It's so interesting. I had Anastasia Makareva, a Russian physicist, on the show, and she was saying, who is directing all of this anger and focus on fossil fuels? It is the one thing that we need. It is the one thing that we're going to have to find a way. We're going to need time to transition. We're always going to need them for some reason. Um, she said, "It's very strange to me why all of the attention is focused on the one thing that we actually do need rather than making the changes that we could tomorrow that would be very, very helpful to the world." For her, it's forests. We need to protect the forests. Um, and I find that extremely interesting that the way that we frame the narrative about, for example, just carbon or just temperatures rising, it completely narrows the focus to the point you can't actually come up with any solution.
Well, for in life after fossil fuels, at least half the book is on biomass because ultimately that will replace fossil fuels just as it did before fossil fuels. It was the main thermal energy source for cooking and heating, for smelting metals, for all making bricks, ceramics, all the other uses. So clearly, uh, planting forests should be high priority, but they don't scale up like coal and oil. They can support a much smaller population, and even in the past, civilizations collapsed because they used up their wood and they could no longer build ships to wage war to get more wood or to trade for wood. So you'll still have boom bust cycles, but uh, with the rise and fall of forests. But we should still be doing that clearly
Yeah,
to prepare for the future. It'll be infrastructure. It will be the steel, the cement now. It will be what everything's built out of.
absolutely. What kind of preparations would you like nation states to be making or advising their corporations or citizens to be making at this juncture?
Well, I have a section at Energy Skeptic called What to Do. And so that has various skills you might want to acquire. Above all, you would want to live in a region that's not over carrying capacity, where there's still water that's likely to fare well during climate change, um, that has forests. Uh, and there's a book written by Holland Day that I review in their America's Most Sustainable Regions. I can't remember the title of the um, post, but it's in the where to be section of what to do. That would be the number one thing people could do. Start a garden. It's wonderful to have fresh organic food, um,
Mm,
right from your backyard or pots on your porch, whatever gets you going with it. Um, there's if you don't, if you're in a condo, there's usually community gardens that you can get a plot at. Um, to start living simpler, um, learn how to play an instrument. Learn to read books again instead of getting
mm.
hooked into the internet and your phone. There, there's all kinds of ways to prepare for what in many ways will be a better future. We are so isolated here. That's part of what's driving the opioid and meth and fentanyl epidemics, because people have lost connection with each other. Some huge percentage of Americans live alone, um, and as energy declines, your social circles and friendships will matter more. There's some good things about it ahead. It's not all gloom and doom.
Yeah, there's certainly a vision for like a post-carbon world in which social equalities even out a little bit better, community becomes the central point of people's lives. There is a dream to be found. There's certainly a symbol to be sold for those who are want to push people, in a better direction. Of course, it's not going to be the people. Certainly when I think of in the UK, that's not gonna be the country that's hit the worst. Already, like we said, in parts of Africa, in, Southeast Asia, the flooding, like these poor, deprived, deliberately oppressed, deliberately undereducated communities are being devastated already by climate change. And so to me, the worry is what what are our choices gonna do to them, before our choices catch up with us?
Well, I don't know how much time there is left of normalcy. I mean, the the decline is not it's not a bell curve, it's more like a cliff
Oh,
because
really?
we extracted oil with enhanced recovery techniques that sucked out oil that normally would have been available after the peak for people in the future. And we got all the easy stuff. Like there's oil in the Arctic, we don't know how to get it. The permafrost would tip over anything you built on it and the roads. The icebergs will mow down any oil rigs offshore. So, and there's very, very deep sea oil, but the energy to do that, you subtract a huge amount of energy from what can be delivered to society. That's why the energy return on invested matters, that Charles Hall and other people were promoting, are still promoting. With the energy return on invested is still mainly reasonable in the Middle East, which is a great place to have something like 80% of the remaining reasonably obtained oil left. It's a hotbed of potential wars and climate change, drought, and other catastrophes. So, I'd say nuclear war is one of the big fears for the future that we don't fight each other um, over the remaining oil. Richard Heinberg and Colin Campbell wrote a book, The Rimini Protocol, about how all nations should agree that they would reduce their use of oil at the same rate as decline to stay under that. That also means reducing population, not reducing it, but encouraging birth control
Mm,
and making the abortion legal and
mm,
taxing the heck out of anyone who has more than one child. There's
mm.
things you could do that won't be done, obviously. You're not even allowed to talk about it. So,
Yeah, true. Um, why not nuclear? Because, I mean, France does it, and they stay at 3.1 tons of carbon per person per year, which is sort of within the UN guidelines as to how to have a sustainable future. Um, there's been no major accident there. It seems to be affordable. I mean, why can't we power our countries with nuclear?
Well, first of all, just like peak oil, there is peak uranium, and there's a great book by Hugo Barty called Extracted about mining and uranium. Could we get it from seawater? All those things that are touted as, making it doable. Secondly, both of my books, When Trucks Stop Running, Energy in the Future of Transportation, and Life After Fossil Fuels, a reality check on alternative energy. If you can't run transportation on electricity, which I go to great lengths to show, if you can't run industry on electricity or anything else, which I go to great lengths to show, I'm also including hydrogen and all the other things. Generating electricity doesn't do you any good. What's the point?
Mm.
And we don't have any way to store nuclear waste still. Yeah, I'm sorry I'm so US centric, but over here, the one place we had built and spent $15 billion researching um, thousands of potential combinations of volcanoes suddenly coming up, of massive floods in the desert, of all the ways things could go wrong. They modeled all of that, and Yucca Mountain simply isn't a problem.
Yucca
Uh,
Mountain?
they shut it down.
Okay.
And so you have right now, wherever there's a nuclear power plant, future generations won't have the energy to get rid of it. I think that's our number one thing now is to get rid of nuclear wastes and bury them for it's the least we could do for future generations, clean up our worst mess. That those byproducts of nuclear can last for a million years, hundreds of thousands of years. Why would we do that to future generations? It's so mean.
That is a hell of a bombshell. Of course, it requires energy to get rid of nuclear waste.
And what we learned from Fukushima is that it's the spent nuclear fuel pools, which are not under a containment vessel, but where they pull the rods out to cool them down, to store them somewhere that doesn't exist someday. That, if the water drained from that, um, which backup generators only provide 1 week of power to pump water in, that uh, a study was done at MIT and another university that showed 8 million people would have to be evacuated if that happened at the Peach Bottom nuclear facility I think it's in Pennsylvania, because of the toxic waste that would get spread. I mean, so every nuclear power plant is a ticking time bomb as it is. We're going to have power outages as the grid gets less reliable in the future, and we don't have a solution for the spent fuel pools. It's hard to say that quickly. It's tongue twister.
Spent fuel pools. Right, okay. I yeah, hadn't thought about it from that end. The maintenance of nuclear and as the grid gets more unreliable. Yeah, how dangerous that would be. What about fusion then, nuclear fusion?
Yeah, well, um, my husband was a science writer at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, and we actually befriended physicists and astrophysicists, and they never got tired of saying it's 30 years away and always will be.
Right.
It's just, uh, and again, electricity, not. What does that do if trucks need to run on diesel fuel? It doesn't help. And see, again, it gets to overshoot. The United Nations estimates because we've been treating our topsoils so badly, on average, we only have 60 years of crops left. So
Oh god.
fusion and electrical contraptions don't restore the soil to its full health. That
Mhm,
requires organic agriculture.
mhm,
It's yet another reason why we need to return to doing that. We're running out of pesticides.
mhm.
They only last 5 years on average. They're causing an insect apocalypse, which echoes all the way up the food chain. Um, and you can grow as much food with organic as industrial. Um, a meta study of over 5,000 uh, studies comparing organic to industrial found something like almost 90% organic produce more food. It can be done. So we need to do that. for the planet.
Hmm.
There's so many issues that are gonna get us diffusion. Nothing really solves anything, not even if, the Earth tank turned out to be a giant gas tank that God periodically filled up.
We just can't continue the way that we are, right?
Yeah, can't do
Ultimately.
it.
What you said about Syria, Yemen, Venezuela having hit peak oil and that being the state of collapse that they now find themselves in. When did they hit peak oil before 2018?
Oh, yeah, long before that. I have a post on that, and there's a book by Nafis Ahmed. I wanna call it The Biophysical Causes of, uh
Falling states collapsing
y
systems?
yeah, and so part of peak oil production, they were never able to grow their own food. They were never, their populations, same with Saudi Arabia, all the Middle Eastern countries, their populations exploded, tenfold or more above what they could feed, before, oil came along, but far beyond what, they could sustain. But with oil money, they could buy food, they could buy
Mm.
water, they could buy the things that they couldn't do for themselves. But with peak oil, um, they no longer could afford to do that. They didn't have the money to import food and other goods that they needed. So it's sort of an indirect. I mean, then the drought has just, been an extra hammer. Many countries are past peak oil. Most countries are past peak oil. I don't remember how many, 150 that ever produced oil, maybe 140 of them are past peak oil.
Oh, so when we say we're past peak oil, is that US?
That's the world,
Right.
because it was mainly, the United States that was Saudi Arabia for a long time that produced most of the oil that won World War II, um, and, and Russia and, the Middle East have always been the major producers and still are, and then all the other areas that had it are in decline. They may still be producing, Mexico is still producing, but, they're well past, their peak.
And do we have a number of years or decades for how long after peak we go off that cliff you're talking about?
Peter Turchin studies the rise and fall of civilizations, and across civilizations throughout history, it usually takes 20 years. It's fast. People who
Bloody
think we have
hell.
centuries, but the thing with, his theories are he doesn't look at how we're a one time only dependent on fossil fuel civilization. It will never happen again. It never happened before. So it could be faster, I think. Personally, I think it'll be faster than that. But
How long do you think it'll take?
well, I mean, it depends what you mean by that too, because it's going to be very uneven.
Hmm.
Some places will do better than others. We're already seeing that.
Which place is doing quite well in all of this? I can't think of one off the top of my head. That might just be a gloom and doom perspective, though.
Well, technically Saudi Arabia, but they're not. They can't defend themselves if someone, China or whoever goes, or Russia go after their oil. So the U.S. as long okay, the only reason the U.S. is doing as well as it is, we never even came close to energy independence. But fracking is the only reason that life carried on after 2005 to present in the United States, which buoyed the world. That's the only reason. I mean, oil production pretty much flatlined in 2005-ish. We've been on a plateau since 2008. Fracked oil was the only oil that nicked it a little bit above the flat line. But
Mm.
now fracked oil has peaked. So now everything is in decline at 8% a
Please.
year. I mean, imagine your salary being cut that much. Now, to some extent, that is offset by pumping CO2 into oil wells to push the oil up to the surface, or water. Like,
Mhm.
it's offset a little, but that won't last because those oil wells are declining and new oil isn't replacing it. We've found less oil the past 7 years than since, like, 1935 or something. We're not finding new oil to
Mm.
replace what's declining.
Mm. And it's also true, isn't it, that the oil that we are finding is like the tar sand oil. So it's
Yeah.
It's not nearly as good as the
Well, and fracked oil is, to a huge extent, mainly good for plastics. That's another
Mhm.
reason you're seeing the plastic explosion. And billions of dollars worth of companies opened up in America to take advantage of the fracked oil to make plastic goods with.
Mm,
Well, I mean, and there's another use of oil. It's used to make 500,000 products, medicine, paint, carpets, clothing.
yeah.
We don't have a replacement for that. Bioplastics are very limited and very expensive.
And also take up space in the natural world that should be given to A, natural, systems, biological ecosystems, and then B, eventually agriculture again. Right. There was one thing that I wanted to, and although I suppose you've covered it. Um but I read your article on direct air capture. So for anyone listening, that's technologies to supposedly suck carbon dioxide out of the air. Um and you and your colleagues did a whole huge peer reviewed thing of like 200 different scientific articles and articles about policies to establish whether or not publicly subsidizing these technologies is worthwhile. And you said, quote, scientific literature does not support the use of public funds to subsidize the commercial development and deployment of industrial carbon removal. Government decisions on carbon removal are largely driven by the question of commercial viability. Public policy decisions are being finance driven, not science driven. I suppose my question then, after speaking with you for this time, would be: are there any government decisions that could be science based at this point now that would actually be worthwhile? Or have we passed the point of real mitigation?
Well, I mean, the carbon capture it emits more CO2 than it can suck up because it takes so much energy. The whole thing is just ridiculous. Yeah, the government has to play a role. That's what bothers me, that they're not paying attention. There should be, um, they could the community colleges, the college curriculums could, focus more on, getting rid of pesticides, integrated pest management, organic agriculture. um, Local governments could have more community gardens. The state level could do more, insulation of homes so that they use less energy. Um, and the heat pumps, they need to, subsidize that. There's your local community. What needs to be done will vary. Like here, our sewage system's falling apart. It's 100 years old. Um, you know, get important infrastructure. We live twice as long as we do, not because of medicine, but because of clean water and air from water treatment plants and sewage treatment plants, and they're falling apart. There's all kinds of infrastructure that could be beefed up. Um, it's a it, mass transit, discouraging private car use. Um, Like, we live near a lake that's filling in if it needs to be dredged, and then it could provide clean water if there's an earthquake or another fire. So much government has to do you that you can't do it on your own, and so for the governments not to recognize this, is a tragedy. It's gonna be a worse tragedy than it needed to be.
I find that to be a very interesting message because there's a lot of emphasis on things that we need to stop doing or not do, or we won't be able to do. But also there are investments that need to be made in and lifestyle decisions that need to be taken about the things that we can do, and seeing it as an opportunity as well, as you said, to maybe have a better life. Um, but to also, it's not just okay. The energy crisis is huge, but it isn't just energy as well. It is also about the fact that how are people going to get access to clean water? How are they going to get access to food? The health industry. I mean, that's the thing. When people talk about plastics, I'm like, how? Go on, do modern medicine without plastic.
Yeah. Yeah,
It's
good luck
so
with that.
essential. Yeah, it's so essential. It's such an amazing. If it's not abused, it is such an amazing material. And there's all of these things that we need to be investing in as well to kind of, but I suppose the problem is that that would demand confronting the issue head on, which is we have a very big problem.
Well, you can't get reelected if you did. But,
Mm,
the other thing the government could do right now, there's these massive grain elevators that store almost all the grain for America in the Midwest. So if things come to a halt, how do you get that grain out to the coasts? 80% of Americans live within 200 miles of the coasts. So California, every state could be building smaller grain elevators and help to distribute food in an emergency. And I once talked to after our house burned down, I was interested in emergency planning, especially for wildfires, but I talked to someone at the state of California, and they said, "That's too political. You'll have different groups saying that one group got more food than another, and we don't wanna deal with it." And, food waste, but there's all kinds of the reason we have civilization is that, wheat and other grains lasted 7 years or more, and the good rulers would store up yeah, they taxed the peasants to death, but when there was a famine, when there was bad weather several years in a row, then if they were good rulers, they distributed the food back to the people, and
right.
so you could see government should do that, today, although that is so, non-capitalistic, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. I was just going to say, you can't do that in a free market, quote unquote. Um,
Yeah.
and you also can you do that under the guise of civil liberty and individual freedom, which our societies like that's what we're fed. That's what keeps us on the rat race, you know.
Yeah.
If you take that away, then what else are we doing?
Yeah, there's literally hundreds of things that we could be doing with our
Mm,
remaining energy to, make life easier for future generations, but we're not doing it.
all right. Okay. Well, Alice, I think I've taken up enough of your time. That was utterly fascinating. Thank you so much for coming on the show and speaking to me and having such depth and breadth of knowledge about this.
Oh, well, thanks for saying that. I'm hope I didn't depress your listeners too much, but there is hope. There are things that could be done. Um, get yourself somewhere in a more ecologically sound area above
Mm,
all.
okay. Tell me, who would you like to platform?
Well, someone that you might be interested in interviewing is Jason Bradford. He's on the board of postcarbon.org. He has been converting industrial farms to organic farms for 10 years and then um, finally bought his own farm. He's a leader in the peak oil movement and peak everything movement, limits to growth. Really smart, really funny. Check out his podcast, Crazy Town.
I absolutely will. Thank you so much for your time. It was such a pleasure speaking with you.
It was fun to talk with you. Take care.
I'm glad. Take care. Bye bye. For more information on Alice's work and her book, Life After Fossil Fuels, I've put the links to her website, Energy Skeptic, and her books in the description box below. Remember, subscribe to the channel and share the episode if you enjoyed it. If you loved it, consider supporting Planet Critical on Patreon, where you can find bonus episodes of my thoughts on each interview. Thank you very much to the Planet Critical patrons, without whom this work would not be possible. Thank you all for listening. See you next week.